My presentation is about the game mechanics of Sonic the Hedgehog. Game mechanics are broken into three parts. There are the pieces, actions, and the rules. First of all, we're going to dive into the pieces. Obviously, Sonic is one of the pieces in the game, as he's the playable character. There are also enemies in the game. These comprise of the smaller robots, and then also Dr. Robotnik, who is the main enemy of Sonic. Then there are rings, which you can collect throughout the game. Then there's obstacles. Obstacles come in many forms. There are spikes, moving obstacles, springs, pits of lava, and other things that you'll discover throughout each level. Then there are checkpoints, and lastly, there's the terrain that Sonic acts on. Next, we'll move into actions. There are really 5 simple actions that Sonic can perform. First of all, he can look up by pressing the up key. Then, he can also look down / duck by pressing the down key. If there is no other platform below him, he won't look down, but if there is another platform below him, Sonic will look down. The looking up and looking down features make it so that the player can anticipate what is coming next. Then, there are the moving from side to side. These are performed with the arrow keys. There are separate rules for speeding up and slowing down that we'll cover later in this walkthrough. Lastly, there is the jump key. And what's interesting about the jump key is that Sonic, he can either jump straight up, or you can press the movement keys while he's jumping in order to aim him somewhere else. This comes in handy later when you're fighting enemies. Next, we come to rules. Each piece in the game has a rule associated with it. For Sonic, the rules are associated with his actions. Sonic is able to move vertically with a height restriction due to his jump, and horizontally. However, his movements can have repercussions if not executed properly. Interaction with objects are dictated by Sonic's states and speeds. Enemies. When interacting with enemies, Sonic must be rolled into a ball. This only occurs when the player engages Sonic into a jumping position. A failure to do so, or, in later levels, a failure to improperly aim at an enemy while rolled into a ball, results in a loss of health for the player. Rings. Sonic can interact with rings either by jumping or by walking through them. The important aspect of rings is how they affect Sonic, and therefore affect gameplay. Rings can be collected, and they act as Sonic's health bar. When the player fails to properly interact with an obstacle or enemies, they lose their rings. If they make another false step while they have no rings, they will lose a life. Conversely, if a player collects 100 rings in a level, they regain a life. Checkpoints. Another positive element for players to interact with are checkpoints. Checkpoints can be interacted with simply by walking past them or jumping into them. If the player dies, they will be sent back to the nearest checkpoint. Sometimes, checkpoints can be hidden, which can be distressing to players if they die and they have to go all the way back to the beginning of the act. In order to go back to a checkpoint, you have to have previously interacted with it. Quite notably, Sonic has no save to the cartridge. This was an intentional act by the developers, as earlier games, such as The Legend of Zelda, had the ability to save. This leads to a sense of pride in mastery for players who have to replay the game, and also for a more addicting gameplay. This was specifically important for the Sonic game because they were competing with Nintendo at the time, and they really wanted to have a game that players would become addicted to and therefore want to buy the Genesis. The Sega Genesis originally included the Sonic the Hedgehog game with the console. Obstacles. The obstacles in the game are many and varied, which gives the gameplay an interesting element. There are spikes, moving obstacles, pits of lava, springs, and other obstacles. In terms of obstacles, they generally need to be avoided, usually by jumping over them. However, there are some that you have to duck under or get through in a certain amount of time, or else Sonic will be squished. Springs are one of the more interesting obstacles because at times, springs can help you get to different parts in the level. But at other times, springs can send you way back in the level, or they can send you into another obstacle, such as spikes or into an enemy where you're going to lose your rings. In later levels, there are more interactive obstacles that Sonic either has to jump on to destroy them, or he has to push blocks in order to enable a button and move an obstacle. Terrain. The terrain affects the player's movement throughout the entire game. If the player does not get up a sufficient amount of speed, the terrain will more greatly affect the player's actions. If the player attempts to jump while on a hill going forward, they will jump at the angle of the hill and not make much progress up the hill. It's very important that players in the early acts gain a handle on this terrain, because as the levels progress, it gets more difficult and harder for the players to get through the terrain without retribution. In between acts, there are bonus levels. Bonus levels can only be unlocked if the player achieves a certain score. The terrain in the bonus levels looks quite a bit different than the normal platform of the game. It's more referential to a pinball machine. However, Sonic's actions function almost exactly the same in here. The only thing is, his movements are limited. All he can do is jump, but the player can apply the knowledge of the mechanics that they learned previously to this level and quite simply master the mechanics of the bonus level. This shows that, as I was saying earlier, this game is meant to be played over and over. It's meant to get the player addicted, and it's meant to lend a sense of mastery when the player is able to learn from previous acts and levels how to deal with more complex problems in the future. This brings us to speed. Speed and the rules which accompany it are an integral part of the game. Sonic speeds up gradually as opposed to other games. For example, in Donkey Kong, when you press the right button, you will immediately get the top speed in the game. However, in Sonic, when you press the right or left button, he gradually speeds up, but he has the ability to go very quick. The same goes for when you release the button. When you release the button, you get a gradual speed down. The exception to this rule is if you are pressing the arrow key in one direction and you decide you want to go in the other direction, Sonic will rapidly slow down. Since Sonic speeds up gradually and progressively gets faster, and since Sonic the Hedgehog was notable for its speed, there is a great range of velocities which the player can experience. The player must quickly learn how to deal with the mechanics of speed in the game. At times, Sonic can fly by quite quickly, and the player can't really tell what's happening on the screen. This adds an element which makes Sonic more complex than the average video game. Players need to understand and gauge how his speed will affect where he goes. Otherwise, they're liable to run into obstacles or enemies and not use proper form. Overall, Sonic is a game with simple controls but somewhat complex mechanics, which allows for a challenging gameplay. The mechanics lend themselves to create a fun and addicting experience for the players.